Hey everybody, this is just a little review of a book titled Max Shachtman is Left, A Socialist Odyssey Through the American Century, by the book is by Peter Drucker, and the review is by Barry Finger. Barry Finger was the editor, or was was or is on the editorial board of the journal New Politics, which you may have read from, which has its origins in American Third Camp Trotskyism. Uh, yeah. Um, so let's see what Barry Finger has to say about this book. I'm reading this because I want to know more about just kind of like the historical background around Shachtman's disagreement with Trotsky in the late 1930s, about whether or not the USSR could in fact be called a worker state, however degenerated. Yeah, just getting a little more biographical background. I've been reading more about a lot about international Trotskyism recently, trying to, with particular emphasis on the how the so-called Russian question was discussed in the 1940s and 1950s, and even earlier, 1930s as well. Anyway. In the late 1960s, the New York branch of the International Socialists, the direct political descendant of and heir apparent to the Third Camp traditions of the Workers' Party 1940 to 1949 and Independent Socialist League 1949 to 58, whose main leader had been Max Shachtman, issued an indignant denial to the, quote, crude distortions and outright misrepresentations, end quote, of the Canaanite Young Socialist Alliance. Foremost among the misconceptions which the International Socialists was at pains to dispel was the characterization of the International Socialists as, quote, Shachtmanite. Quote, a class line is drawn, they charged, between, quote, us and the Shachtmanites. A few concrete examples. Unlike the Shachtmanites, our tendency A opposed the Bay of Pigs invasion, or Cuba, by the U.S.-backed right-wingers in 1961. B calls for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam and has done so for at least 5 years. C supported the black community in the New York teacher strike. D supports rank-and-file struggles in the trade unions. E defends the new movements against the repression. If our paper claimed that Jim Cannon was a Stalinist because he was once in the same Comintern as Stalin, you would be torn between outrage and amusement. To link our tendency politically to the Shachtmanites is to make the same kind of amalgam, and we are not amused, end quote. Ironically, while repudiating Shachtman, without whose previous 30-year legacy there would quite simply have been no international socialists, the organization's common revolutionary ancestry with the Canaanites, an ancestry long stripped of any operative significance or meaningful contemporary political reference, was emphatically, even enthusiastically reaffirmed. Yet in a very real sense, this paradox speaks volumes to the tragic renegacy of Shachtman in the final phase of his life from the late 1950s, when he successfully agitated to dissolve his organization in the long moribund Socialist Party to his death in 1972. I have a paper here from Julius Jacobson, who was one of the originators of the New Politics Journal, which Barry Finger, like I said, is on the editorial board of, called The Two Deaths of Max Shachtman. Of the inner political life of this later Shachtman, we know nothing, paradoxically, virtually nothing. His thought processes were no longer committed to paper. His opinions were confined only to an inner circle. Writer's block was the psychological price the latter Shachtman paid for the repudiation of a lifetime of revolutionary commitment. Yet it is precisely this commitment, a contribution virtually without parallel within his generation, that merits this long overdue evaluation of this singular personality and the extraordinary movement which he nourished. is the political significance of this other Shachtman, which Peter Drucker recognizes and to whom he pays a critical yet well-deserved tribute. Shachtman entered the socialist movement in 1921 at the age of 17, his formative experiences decisively shaped by the Russian Revolution. His ramified course and fate virtually engulfed all political events for the ensuing half-century and more. In the mid-1920s, he became an editor of The Young Worker, a frequent contributor to The Daily Worker, and The Liberator, was an alternate to the Central Committee of the Communist Party and one of its delegates to the 1925 and 1927 conferences of the Third International. 7 years after entering the ranks of the movement, Shachtman was expelled, branded a Trotskyist for having circulated Trotsky Suppressed, the Third International after Lenin, smuggled out of Russia by James Cannon. Within the next 15 years, Shachtman was to play a central role in affiliating over 25 national sections to the Fourth International and was to forge its theoretical journal, The New International, into a powerful weapon of political analysis and agitation. Shachtman tirelessly translated and edited and inscribed forewords to dozens of Trotsky's works and was ultimately to remain literary executor of the old man's estate, the old man, people generally called Trotsky if you didn't know that, despite having broken from the Cannonites. What earned Shachtman his place in the history of revolutionary ideas? To defend the 1917 socialist experiment in revolutionary democracy without either deifying its leaders or justifying its every deed, and to salvage its heritage and inspiration from the corruption of Stalinism, Shachtman and his comrades were driven to continuously extend their analysis beyond the rapidly ossifying confines of, quote, orthodox Trotskyism. Stalinism, they argued, was not merely a corrupt outgrowth of an otherwise intact workers' state, but a constitutive component of a new counter-revolutionary social system built over the gravesite of the Russian Revolution. This, quote, bureaucratic collectivism was the result of the autonomization of state power, the transformation of the state bureaucracy into an independent and uncontrolled class formation. They, like the classical ruling classes of Oriental despotism, exercised control over the means of production not by right of private property, but collectively through their amassing of an unchallengeable state monopoly over the levers of economic, political, and social power. The Workers' Party was guided by Lenin's dictum that, quote, whoever wants to approach socialism by any means other than political democracy will inevitably arrive at absurd and reactionary conclusions, end quote. The inseparability of socialism and democracy was the distinctive hallmark of independent socialism. The Workers' Party Independent Socialist League viewed the world of their day as a three-cornered struggle between two ruling classes, capitalist and bureaucratic collectivist, which continually threatened humanity with extinction, and a third camp consisting of the working class and the oppressed masses who were its natural allies. The power of this latent revolutionary democratic movement from below lies as yet dormant until, roused by the defense of its own vital interest, it is driven into irreconcilable opposition to the two ruling classes. Whatever their self-conception, either as a mass party information or as a ginger group at the left wing of the labor, civil rights, and peace movements, the Shachtmanites not only refused to extend a, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, but sharpened and honed their analysis in revolutionary opposition to all sides during World War II. They were the only socialist grouping in America to have done so. They mercilessly exposed the war against fascism as a vehicle that would advance totalitarianism on a world scale, leaving the world to be policed by the new victors of an imperialist base, while enforcing and corrupting the workers' organizations and the bourgeois democracies through their intensified self-negation as tools used by any social purpose beyond the pursuit of victory. While the Socialist Workers' Partiers were hunkering down to, quote, preserve the cadre, end quote, by keeping quiet in the unions and elsewhere, the Workers' Party used its opposition to both war camps to break heavy industry, now numbering in its ranks virtually 80% of the Workers' Party membership. Unencumbered by loyalties, residual or otherwise, to any ruling class, the Workers' Party fought to revoke the wartime no-strike pledge, to remove labor from the War Labor Board, to push for equal pay and equal work against Jim Crow racism, both in industry and in the military, and for the immediate establishment of a U.S. Labor Party. By 1943, the weekly paper of the Shachtmanites, Labor Action, carried its message with press runs up to 40,000. Its consistent pursuit of working-class interests, including black and white unity, brought the Workers' Party into consistent loggerheads with the Stalinists and their supporters. The Communist Party was distinguished among the labor movement factions by the virulent consistency of their support for the war. They supported the forcible confinement of Japanese Americans, sabotaged the Double V campaign to end segregation, and deployed police-like tenacity in persecuting worker militants who threatened wartime production. Their experiences stimulated a more profound understanding of Stalinism and culminated in a unique form of anti-Stalinism theoretically consistent with the theory of bureaucratic collectivism. The Workers' Party's anti-Stalinism represented a marked departure from Trotskyism, which held social democratic reformism and Stalinism to be essentially symmetrical phenomenon. The Social Democrats were agents of their respective ruling classes, and the Stalinist agents first of Russia and later of various, quote, workers' state oligarchies. To Shachtman and his movement, quote, none of the old designations of, quote, left, quote, right, quote, centrist applied to Stalinism, end quote. This conclusion was an outgrowth of its developing appraisal of Stalinism as a distinct anti-working class society. In its reformism and its pro-Western defensism, social democracy reflects the conservative policies of the labor leadership, which for all its class collaborationism is nevertheless still tragically tied to the working class. Trade union bureaucracies and the Labor Party leaderships which rest on them can only secure and advance their bureaucratic privileges under those conditions in which bourgeois democracy is itself preserved, for these are the only circumstances conducive to the maintenance of an independent labor movement. That the Social Democrats struggle to maintain an independent labor movement in an ineffectual and inconsistent manner, attempting to preserve democracy by stifling both totalitarian forces and revolution, was well understood and did not in the least detract from the general proposition. The Stalinist parties, on the other hand, are the ideological agents not of a conservative section of a working-class movement, but of a social force whose interests are diametrically opposed to an independent workers' movement, and whose triumph would be unattainable without the complete annihilation of the labor movement in all the labor movement's forms. Quote, Stalinism is a reactionary, totalitarian, anti-bourgeois, and anti-proletarian current in the labor movement, but not of the labor movement, ... end quote. These remain the standards against which any historical evaluation of the various national communist parties must be measured. Quote, this is like a big quote in like the middle of the text. I don't know if it's like, if it's just like something said elsewhere, or if it's like it's like in huge letters. So I don't know if it's just like a highlight of the text or if it's like part of the text is reading it. But I'll just read it now just because it's here. Quote, the expected working class radicalization failed to materialize at the termination of World War II. Indeed, the party failed to keep the workers recruited during the war, end quote. From this perspective, the Workers' Party oriented its day-to-day trade union work towards combining with progressive anti-Stalinists as well as conservative elements against the Communist Party. This by no means led it to endorse the government's anti-communist witch hunts or loyalty oaths within the union movement. On the contrary, Shachtman held McCarthyism to be not only a threat to democracy but a potential harbinger of a more sweeping assault against the left. A labor movement able to oust Stalinism from its own ranks would be one fortified in struggle by a heightened democratic and class consciousness, imported from above by the capitalist state and imposed out of fear of suppression of trade union rights. Such anti-communism would constitute a working class debacle. The Workers' Party, to its abiding credit, exposed the vacillations of weak-kneed ex-radicals and liberals, the spiritual ancestors of today's neoconservatives, in defense of the democratic rights of the Stalinists, despite having been on the receiving end of not a few CP frame-ups and violence in the CIO and elsewhere. Thus the Shachtmanites protested the conviction of the Stalinist Harry Bridges, protested the McCarran Act of 1950, under which communists were sentenced, and defended university teachers being harassed and fired as subversives. The expected working-class radicalization failed to materialize at the termination of World War II. Indeed, the party failed to keep the workers recruited during the war, losing many in the course of just a few months after they succumbed to the grueling routines of party life. An attempted reunification with the Socialist Workers' Party failed, having been scuttled by Cannon's concept of a monolithic party. In 1948, the Workers' Party cut its last links with the Fourth International over the Second World Congress's criminally inept position that the countries of Eastern Europe overtaken by Stalinism remained capitalist states, but that if the Communist parties proved capable of overturning capitalism, then Stalinism would have to be seen as revolutionary. This, Shachtman argued, would logically amount to saying that the International was unnecessary. It's interesting to note that in 1948, I believe this is the same time that Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort in France and Raya Dunayevskaya and CLR James also broke with the Fourth International and Trotskyism. For them, it was broke with the Trotskyism in general, or at least the Trotskyist movement, on the grounds of based upon their analysis of the USSR. But for them, Raya Dunayevskaya and CLR James as a form of state capitalism, while Claude Lefort and Cornelius Castoriadis didn't really start to call the Soviet Union capitalist until later in the 1950s. But for a period, at least, they were calling it something very similar to, I'd have to research it more, but from my cursory research, something very similar to what the third campus would have to say regarding the USSR as a bureaucratic collectivist. In 1948, the Workers' Party cut its last links with the Fourth International, blah, blah, blah. This, Shachtman argued, would logically amount to saying the International was unnecessary. By 1949, the Workers' Party was half the size the Workers' Party had been coming out of the war. The Revolutionary Party perspective was abandoned, and the Workers' Party, now renamed the Independent Socialist League, identified itself as a more limited propaganda group, with its main task that of bringing the ideas of socialism to the working class and the oppressed. The Independent Socialist League asserted that the main task of the labor movement in the United States is its political self-organization, the development of a labor party, and that the development of a political program is indispensable, not only once such a party is formed, but also for the purpose of breathing life into its formative process. The program it put forward was not for the socialist reorganization of society, but one consistent with the struggle to preserve and extend democracy and to protect the working class and the working class's allies from the reactionary war economy, which the Independent Socialist League claimed capitalism to be in the grip of, and from the looming Third World War itself. The fight to protect democratic rights would increasingly become the means of fighting for socialism. The Independent Socialist League declared its complete non-confidence in any capitalist government, no matter how liberal, to consistently champion the elementary democratic needs of the people or break with the imperialist traditions and reactionary policies of the past needed to combat Stalinism in a progressive fashion. It is in this period, the late 1940s and 1950s, that Peter Drucker is at his weakest. Left unexamined is the notable relationship between the Shachtmanites and leading intellectuals who passed through the Independent Socialist League or its youth movement. Drucker's treatment of the turn of the Shachtmanites towards the Communist Party and the trade unions appears to dispute the basic Workers' Party Independent Socialist League formulation of the alien character of Stalinism to the labor movement without offering an alternative evaluation. It is evident in Drucker's misguided characterization of the 1948 Wallace campaign and his pained failure to accept that the Wallace movement had become a tool of the Stalinists. Inklings are detected in the late 1940s and early 1950s of Shachtman's later right-wing trajectory, but they are based on misinterpretation or an impressionistic force of the facts. Some of Drucker's comments on the Shachtmanite orientation during the Cold War understate the complicity of Stalinism in poisoning the atmosphere of world politics. These errors are unavoidable in writing partisan political history when the political sources of the author's commitment remain unelaborated or sketchy and piecemeal at best, as do Drucker's. Yet it is in the final chapters of Shachtman's life a period of, there is no way of putting it charitably, socialist renegacy, for which Drucker draws on a remarkably poignant reserve of sympathy. The reasons behind Shachtman's moral collapse cannot be chalked up to mere Stalinophobia, an all-consuming hatred for Stalinism which subordinates all other political considerations and values to Stalinism's defeat. The explanation is rather found in conjunction with anti-Stalinism, the belief that the conscious cadres of socialism had been destroyed by fascism and Stalinism, and compounded by the continuously demoralizing framework of operating in the absence of a politically organized working class. That, in short, there no longer existed the objective political forces from which a socialist movement could arise and build a viable alternative. The Independent Socialist League was rejected as a holding action in favor of bureaucratic substitutes which could create a simulacrum of momentum. Quote, he convinced himself that the AFL-CIO was almost a mass socialist movement, that the Democratic Party was almost a labor party, that Johnson's Great Society had almost made African Americans equal, and that the United States had almost saved Vietnam for democracy, end quote. The enduring contributions and theoretical breakthroughs of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League have enormous resonance for socialists today. Their spirited celebration of the Bolshevik Revolution, not only against its detractors, but also against its authoritarian would-be defenders such as Isaac Deutscher, are electrifying in their originality, instructive in their depth, and forever relevant as a subterranean entrance to one of the most moving, liberating, and tragic events of the century. The movement was without compare in charting the degeneration of the revolution, chronicling the Moscow trials, and charting the evolution of bureaucratic collectivism. From their application and development of Lenin's anti-war analyses to the Second World War and then the Korean War, to their expositions on the national question, from their elaborations of radical trade union tactics, to their writings on Palestine and Zionism, from the tactics of the Popular Front, to their examination of socialist politics during the Cold War, from their fight against McCarthyism in defense of civil liberties, to their manifold investigations into the history of revolutionary parties and movements, the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League brought an unparalleled range of revolutionary experience and reflection to bear as a guide to socialist action. Drucker adds immensely to our appreciation of this remarkable movement through his panoramic review centered on the career of Max Shachtman. For this he merits the gratitude of every thinking socialist. Drucker fills a void in the history not only of American socialism, but in the breadth and sweep of revolutionary Marxism itself. That Shachtman and his movement conquered a place in the history of revolutionary politics is incontestable, but not as, say, George Novack would have it, because he, quote, ably expounded the criticisms of Stalinism and social democracy developed by the Russian left opposition, end quote, and thus helped lay the foundations of the Trotskyist Fourth International. It is in no small measure that Drucker, too, deserves our respect for this refreshing recognition, all the more remarkable for his adherence to the Canaanite tradition, which militates so forcefully against such an appreciation. For all that, the fundamental gap to this work is it's fair to recognize the formidable contributions of those comrades who continued standing fast in full commitment to the formative revolutionary politics of the Third Camp. It is also the efforts above all of Julius and Felix Jacobson, of Hal Draper, of New Politics magazine, which allows for an unbroken generational memory extending to the New Left and beyond. The end.